Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, welcome and thank you for being here. As I said, my name is Harold Mock. I'm the director of Georgia College's Leadership Programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Inspire Forum on Leadership. This afternoon, we will have a panel discussion on the power of the public square. Before we begin, I must say that this event is being recorded. By participating in this program, you are consenting to being recorded. If you would prefer to view the recording instead of participating, please leave this meeting and email leadership.programs@gcsu.edu. As I said, delighted to welcome you all here. And I especially want to welcome as well our guests who are joining us online. Thank you all for participating. Glad to have three of my colleagues here this afternoon to discuss our theme, the power of the public square. I'll introduce them momentarily, but before I do so, I want to say a few words about this event. The Inspire Forum on Leadership is Georgia College's presentation discussion series on leadership for the public good. One of the most important elements of these events is that we hear from you, our students and guests. We will have an opportunity this afternoon for questions, and I encourage you to shape the conversation that we are going to have this afternoon with our three panelists by listening for things that maybe stimulate a question, that make you want to learn more, that make you want to ask a follow-up, and raise that in our discussion period. Help us to have a good conversation. Likewise, consider as we're talking this evening about other topics that you might like to explore in a future forum. We always ask for recommendations and nominations for future speakers or future questions. So if you find that tonight's conversation brings up something that you'd like to learn more about, please share it with us. You can do so just by talking with one of the staff members or connect with us online at gcsu.edu/leadership. This evening's event is possible with the support of the Georgia College Foundation, the Office of the Provost, the Student Government Association, and the Constitution Week Committee. I know that many of you are here this evening in the context of Constitution Week, so I especially want to thank you for being a part of those celebrations, and I want to encourage you throughout the week to continue learning about the Constitution and celebrating that week at Georgia College. Tomorrow's event is at noon, correct, Dr. Hoffmann?
That is
Times Talk. As part of Constitution Week, it will be at noon in the Russell Library?
Yes. Second floor, Russell Library.
Okay. So I encourage you to participate in that as well. The second floor of Russell Library tomorrow, Times Talk at noon, and I believe some pizza will be provided as well. So with that said, thank you for being here. I'd like to introduce our three panelists, tell you who they are and what brings them here this evening. First is Vivian Cassaniti. Vivian is the 2022-23 Newman Civic Fellow. She's a member of Georgia College's class of 2024, studying political science and philosophy. She serves as president of Georgia College's mock trial team and is also a member of the Council of Student Ambassadors. She's an alumna of the Leadership Certificate Program and also a member of the Georgia Education Mentorship Program. Last semester, she completed an excellent public service project regarding broadband access in the rural South. So Vivian, thank you for being here. Likewise, joined by my colleague, Dr. Kelley Ditzel. Dr. Ditzel is Assistant Professor of Public Administration at Georgia College, where she also serves as Campus Director of the Certified Nonprofit Management Program. Dr. Ditzel's research focuses on education policy, race and class in education, and the nonprofit sector. And finally, joined as well by my colleague, Dr. Jan Hoffmann. Dr. Hoffmann is Professor of Rhetoric at Georgia College and is the coordinator of the American Democracy Project. She joined the faculty at Georgia College in 2002. She has served as presiding officer of the University Senate, as a Governor's Teaching Fellow, Research Associate for the National Issues Forum Institute, and President of the Georgia Communications Association. She's the recipient of Georgia College's Irene Rose Community Service Award, the university's Distinguished Service Award, and just earlier this year was the inaugural recipient of the Flish-Harris Award for Leadership in the Cause of a Liberal Education. So please join me in welcoming these three wonderful panelists, and we'll get our conversation started. So as I said, I've got some questions for us, and I'll put those questions to our panelists. But as I do that, I encourage you to think about what questions you have, either for the group or for an individual panelist, about our topic. So much of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that many of us have been learning about and celebrating this week were debated in public squares, in town meetings, in Quaker meeting houses, the village green, the local mercantile, and so forth. That's an image that is iconic to American history, a public square, a place where people come together. We come together around shared ideas and interests. We come together to solve our problems, to debate. One of the earliest being, should the United States declare independence? Should we ratify this Constitution? So a question that I have for us is, to what degree is the notion of the public square organic to American democracy? And Dr. Hoffmann, I'd like to put that question to you, in part because of the book that you have to recommend to us, but that's my question for you. To what degree is the notion of the public square organic to American democracy?
Thank you for that question. And one of the things, if you've ever either seen a reading of the Declaration of Independence or actually participated in, kind of one of those Reader's Theater versions of it, you realize very quickly that unlike the Constitution, it really was meant to be spoken, because what the founders did, hot off the press after it had been, kind of printed out a few times, was they literally took it to the town squares of all of the, cities at the time that they could get to, and they read it so that people would be able to listen to it and respond to it. So it truly is in our DNA, I believe, in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Other thoughts on that notion of the public square? So much of democracy is meant to be sorted out in public exchange. How do we, as a democracy, continue that tradition of, public debate, public deliberation, and dialogue?
I think discourse continues to be important, and who is a part of these conversations has changed, obviously, over time. Who is enabled and empowered to participate in the various conversations. I'll also argue, we were talking about this just a few minutes ago, the role that technology and social media has played in this to really potentially widen the conversation for those who have access, right? And so that conversation that may have been physically by one group in the town and literally the public square is now in various different formats all over the internet, as you guys, I'm sure, participate in. And so there are pros and cons to that, right? It definitely has included more people in the conversation overall. Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Ditzel you've raised the question of technology. And when I think about the public square, I often think about a physical place, a place where people might come together. But the lives that many of our students will lead are pretty different than, say, the lives that their grandparents or their great-grandparents led. You guys, by and large, are much less likely to be stationary. You're much less likely to spend your whole life in a single community. You're much less likely to work, perhaps, at the same company, where you're with the same people regularly all the time. And what is changing perhaps the nature of the communities that we have is that we can maintain connection with people even when we're not physically together. So in a lot of ways, we have taken the idea of the public square and maybe digitized it. Is that a fair statement, Dr. Ditzel?
Yes.
Vivian, I know you've done a lot of work on this topic, research and writing, and I wonder if you have thoughts about that too, how technology has shaped or reshaped the public square.
Well, I think as Dr. Ditzel, you just mentioned, it's changed who has had access to it, and in a lot of ways, it's increased the amount of inclusion because, like Dr. Mock said, anyone can access technology from mostly anywhere. But the part of the conversation that I think gets left out is who is excluded and how far that degree that they are excluded. Specifically when we talk about, this may seem trivial, but actual access to Wi-Fi, that will really change how you're able to get in on these conversations. I think Twitter is that's the biggest social media platform where a lot of political debates will happen that might have happened in a public square. But you're barred from and joining those conversations if you don't have access to technology or even Wi-Fi. And that significantly affects a lot of rural areas, but there are a lot of urban areas as well that will feel those effects. So while it does increase inclusion, it often leaves a lot of people out.
So what I hear you saying, Vivian, is that it's perhaps a double-edged sword. In some ways, the role of digitizing the public square, allowing the public square to be something that's sorted out over social media, has democratized the way that we communicate. By and large, you don't have to be in a position of public influence or power to contribute your ideas. At the same time, we have a lot of people, even in the state of Georgia, who don't have regular access, meaning uninterrupted access to broadband. So if we think about, just to share some facts with you, if we think about the state that we live in, the state of Georgia, it's really a place of paradox. We have some of the wealthiest communities that you can imagine in this state. We also have some of the most backbreaking poverty you can imagine in this state. We have communities that, again, excellent schools, all the resources that we might want for our children to have. We also have communities that nowhere near the types of resources that we would want. In this state of Georgia, 40% of children will go to bed tonight not having had 3 meals. That's, I think, still I've known that for a long time. For me, that's still quite a sobering fact to consider. So in a lot of cases, perhaps when our basic needs are not being met, it's hard to contribute meaningfully in the public square. And I know, Vivian, based on work that you've done in the past, you see access to broadband as one of those basic needs. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when, I'm sure we can all realize this, COVID hasn't really given us more disparities, it's just highlighted pre-existing ones. So when you think about welfare programs, education programs, working from home is the most obvious one, you need technology for that. You need broadband access specifically. A lot of welfare programs you can only apply for with the federal government online, which leaves out a huge section of specifically our Georgia population. So it's, like you said, it's a double-edged sword, but it's more important that we include the people who've been left behind and who are continued to be left behind because everything is becoming so digitized and such a heavy focus on technology, especially when we talk about politics and when we talk about how to share information with each other. A lot of it's just online, which we don't really realize that because we all have that kind of access.
Yeah, and to that end, as Vivian said, COVID perhaps highlighted a lot of the disparities that communities across America faced. Certainly in the state of Georgia, it highlighted a lot of disparities. And you all can easily read this if you look at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or sort of follow this in the news in Georgia. There were a lot of communities, particularly in the rural parts of our state, that had to find innovative ways of trying to get children online when they were in quarantine during COVID. So some of you may have seen or read or taken part in where communities specially outfitted school buses with Wi-Fi capability and sort of drove them to parking lots where kids could get online to do their homework. That's something, I live in a city, that's not really something I was terribly worried about, but it makes, I would say, a big difference on the note, Vivian, that you're raising of who is included and who is excluded from the public square. When people are excluded, whether intentionally or unintentionally, can we really call it a public square? Dr. Ditzel, may I put that question to you?
With my reaction. No, indeed we cannot. So I think it's important to the extent possible to really engage all aspects of community and to have all voices present. And we know that hasn't been the case over history, and that's changed and fluctuated. Civil rights, women's rights, various issues. However, one would argue, and you said leadership for the public good, right? That is the purpose, the point is for the public good. And so to that extent, it really is the opportunity to have services, needs, conversation for all aspects of the public.
Yeah, that is perhaps a conversation that is not just inclusive of everyone in the public, but also serves a collective good or serves the public good. Is that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Dr. Hoffmann, I'd like to raise this question with you, particularly given your expertise in rhetoric, and that is to ask, has the digitization of the public square in any ways changed the mechanisms of our discourse? Has it perhaps degraded public discourse?
Thank you for that question. And allow me a brief digression that I think will set up probably the expectation you would have of me.
I have never had a Jan Hoffmann digression that didn't turn out well in the end. So
Well,
please.
I'll get back to you on that then. Because here's the thing. This is such an honor to be here, honestly, with you all. And kind of as a player to be named later, I realize how far short I feel like I am from the standards of the usual conversant here in the Inspire Forum. And so my mind is kind of racing with a lot of different images. One of them is running through my head from the 2009 MTV Video Music Awards. Now, do the math, and then when you have done it, shout out how old you were in 2009, okay? So just 2009, how old were you? Yeah, okay, great. So that's exactly what, so let me take you there, all right? You may have seen the video of it, because it did live on for a little while in infamy. 2009 MTV Video Music Awards. Taylor Swift had just been given the award for Best Video by a Female Artist. And she had been brought on the stage in a Cinderella carriage, right? She had just crossed over from country to pop. She was really young. So the MO here, you know, Cinderella's arrived at the ball, and isn't that great? And so she just gets out. Thank you so much. I am so grateful to win this award, when Kanye West, who had imbibed most of a bottle of Hennessy, all right, up to that point, jumped up out of the seats, and he ran up and he grabbed the microphone from her and he said, "Yo, Taylor, I'm happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But Beyonce made the best video of all time, the best video of all time." So what does that have to do with me, you ask? Quite simply, as I look at the demographic and I think about these issues with digitization versus face-to-face, I am just sure that in your head, you have to be saying to yourself, "Yo, old white lady, I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish." Because that's like, I'm not encouraged about the future of the public square. Because in my own experience, what we have done digitally, what we have done online, what we have done virtually, I wouldn't call that social media. I'd really call most of it anti-social media. It doesn't feed my soul. It feels like it sucks the soul out of me. So the more time we spend in that sphere, I think the less likely we are to capture anything like, you know, what has been the through line so far. And also, I'm going to take it to face-to-face. So I have really not a whole lot to say about the digitization. I don't see it as a positive force. I haven't seen it work so far that way. I don't expect that it will. But I think the real public square is a great equalizer. And I think the more time that we spend with each other in that common space contributes more to the common good than any kind of other media that we use to do that. And I was just, anyone here from Madison or Covington area? Because I just spent some time in both places. They both have lovely public squares. And again, I don't know if there's any Gilmore Girls fans out here. Keep aging myself. But it's very Stars Hollow feeling. I mean, I was up there this weekend, went to the Mystic Grill, and there was just all kinds of really cool stuff going on in the square. And people were there, and they were truly enjoying that. Same thing with Madison. Beautiful park where you really can hold events. Milledgeville doesn't have a public square. I think first you got to have a public square. You got to have, build in infrastructure for people to do that. And I'm looking at Provost Spiro, who one of the things that I love that we have done here at Georgia College is we've used the front campus for some civic town square stuff. Since 2004, we've run a debate, a debate watch of the presidential candidate debates on Front Campus, and really invited the whole town to come. And when we're in those moments together, that's where I feel the most like the way I want to feel about the public square and the public good and the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Thank you for letting me ramble.
So, thank you, Dr. Hoffmann. And we've got a few ideas on the table right now. One of them is something I know that you all will probably have questions about or thoughts about, and it is the role of social media in perhaps strengthening our public institutions or weakening or degrading our public institutions. Dr. Hoffmann, it sounds like you're concerned that they are degrading our public institutions, or you're not fully convinced that they're a force for good. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And there's another way to look at it, and I anticipated we would get to this point, and it is to say that I can also think of times when social media has done good things for democracy, for pluralism. People who maybe didn't have a voice had a voice, and that example, it's maybe not an American example, but it's the Arab Spring, in which social media gave voice to people who largely did not have a voice, whether because of the regime they were in or because of their inability to organize or the impediments to their organization. So I see both good and I see both positive and negative effects to social media, but I think in particular what you've highlighted for us is the question of the voice that we bring into the public square and how we engage with people. Your example of Taylor Swift and Kanye West is, I think, in a lot of ways the perfect example of how we often are looking more to be entertained in the public square than we are to be informed. We're sometimes bringing the wrong expectation into the public square. But that said, I don't want to monopolize this question. Dr. Ditzel, Vivian, do you have thoughts on this?
I definitely agree that there's value in physically sharing space and having open conversation. But I do want to acknowledge that I think digitization in social media has actually increased voice and access. It's elevated issues in a way that I think can't be denied. And again, with COVID, these things existed, unfortunately. There's such great inequities. However, it exacerbated them. And with that, unfortunately, many of these things are coming to a head. But the use of social media and Twitter and different virtual interactions, I think really has expanded who has a seat, in theory, at this public square table. And that is something that we can't ignore. And even previously, when you think about it, if you had a public square and you had people coming together, everyone isn't able to physically come. If it's making this up, a weekday evening at 6 o'clock, right? Perhaps people are limited with job, with children, with other requirements and expectations. However, if they had the option to, hop on their phone and do it in such a way, that potentially is increasing those who are able to be engaged.
That's right.
I totally agree with you. I take back every single thing I said right up until this moment.
Something I would add is, while it does bring more people to the table, it excludes who can sort of come and have these conversations, it also, I feel like it puts a weird pressure on all of us to form opinions about everything that we see. And so now that we have all these different social media platforms and technology and news, we see a lot more than we normally would. We see disaster and catastrophe and crisis every single day. And I have felt, and some of my peers have felt, this odd pressure to form an opinion as soon as you've seen it and stick with that opinion and defend it. And first off, not everything needs an opinion on. Some things are just events that happen. But it also, I feel like we'll get into the conversation about polarization, but I think that contributes to a lot of the polarization that we see, because this constant feed of information, while it can inform a lot of us, which it does, it also puts this pressure to sort of take a stance, defend it, and don't move from it. And that's just going to pit people into their trenches more than I think sometimes we already are.
I think the quality of information is definitely questionable, right? Everything is not necessarily a fact and valid. And then I also wonder, we may get there as well, is yes, conversation is increasing and potentially who's involved in those conversations at times. But what's actually resulting from those conversations? Are decisions being made? Are we actually moving forward in different ways? So I guess I question the consequences and actual decision-making from the increased
I think that both of you, Ms. Cassaniti and Dr. Ditzel, raise an important point, and it's not enough to have to be a part of the conversation. We also have to be sort of bringing our sort of best intellectual prowess into the conversation. And sometimes the nature of public discourse sort of forces us into thinking we have to take a stand on something. Most issues don't have two sides, though. Most issues have like 40 sides to them. Some issues only have one side, and we pretend that they are in dispute to give the illusion of fairness to people who don't have the information. And to that end, this is maybe a shameless plug, but if you see up on this screen a QR code, that will take you to accessnyt.com. Georgia College provides free access for all the members of our community to the New York Times. You can go to accessnyt.com and click Create an Account. You can sign in with your Bobcats or your GCSU email, set up a password, and then you'll get instructions in your email about how to verify your identity. And that is a good way for you to stay informed, to stay up to date on information, to have the same information that a lot of people around you have. And as you enter discussions that are of public interest, to feel like you're, I guess, informed and empowered. To that end, I will embarrass Dr. Hoffmann and say that she was the person who helped to organize this, 15 years ago?
2005.
Okay, so more than that, 17 years ago, to provide all members of the Georgia College community with access to the New York Times. Dr. Hoffmann referenced our provost, Dr. Spiro, who the Office of the Provost funds all of your access to the New York Times. So I'd encourage you, take a quick picture of this QR code, and set up your access to the New York Times. Dr. Hoffmann, would you add anything to that? What's the value in, say, folks having access to a newspaper like this?
Fact-checking, I think more than anything else. It's that they have a firewall, as all good news sources do, between their news analysis and their news gathering. And so you know that they have fact-checked what they put out there as news before. And if they make a mistake, they retract it, and they'll tell you. So that's a really precious part of democracy.
And to that end, so I've got some questions for us about how we perhaps can bring our sort of best selves, our best intentions into the public square. One thing that we can do, of course, is come informed, read things like the New York Times, or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. We can read our local organs, the Union Recorder, the Baldwin Bulletin, things that are closer to home for us, like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. But I put that question to each of you. What are other things that we need to do if we want to be effective participants and contributors in the public square, in public discourse?
I'd say one of the first things is to recognize that we all are operating from a similar level of humanity. That may sound too philosophical. I apologize. I am a philosophy major. But I think the important thing is that we all have different identities, and we all are involved in different communities. And each one of those will inform every single decision that we make and every single stance that we will take. And so the first thing I think is just to recognize that, and it sounds cliche, but respect people from where they come from. Because that's much like it's an integral part of yourself, it's an integral part of them. I think after you hit that baseline, then you can answer some more complicated questions. So.
I was going to say something similar, although unfortunately I don't know that we all operate from that sense of humanity immediately. But I would also encourage listening, getting outside of yourself, seeking to understand the experience of others. I think cultural competence in our increasingly diverse world, and diverse in a variety of ways, right? There's so many different aspects to that. It's critically important. And if it really is a democracy of the people, for the people, then all of the people need to be included.
Yeah, well said. And all I can add is it's not a spectator sport. Democracy is really hard, and it demands a lot out of each and every one of us. And so as easy as and desirable sometimes as it feels to want to avoid it and to hear the word politics and go, ugh, which I understand, given the way it's being practiced, if you will. But that we have to do the opposite of what that desire is and jump into it to get the government that we deserve. It is of the people, by the people, for the people. And so you can't wait around for somebody else to do it. So that's the thing that I keep reminding myself. I've been so immersed with the Queen's death and, wearing her on my jacket here. I came here tonight really wanting to tell you that there are two people who inspire me. One of those is a group, and it's you, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The other is the Queen, because of her life of service, because of the kind of leadership that she represented, and that's the kind of person I desire to be, that I aspire to be. So none of us are ever going to be the head of a commonwealth or a country, but you guys lead Greek organizations, and you lead RSOs, and you lead team projects, and to lead with that devotion to service and that kind of an approach is, I think, the way to leave a legacy of a life well lived and a life well loved, and contributes as much as anyone can to nurturing this beautiful experiment we call democracy.
And I'd like to try something out with you guys. Dr. Hoffmann she kind of inspired me in a way that I don't often hear people talk in soaring rhetoric about democracy. But I'm going to turn it around and say, like a standard American government textbook, like you guys think back to the textbooks that you might have had in high school when you took American government, it holds you guys in pretty low opinion, right? It says that you're pretty much not likely to vote, you're self-interested, you spend a lot of time on your telephone, you're politically disengaged. That's what a lot of the punditry says about you. So if you read things in like the New Yorker or the Atlantic, or it tends to say that you all are a relatively disengaged generation. But I'm going to say I feel like the pundits have gotten you wrong, and here's my take. You guys, most of you were born, say, late 90s, early 2000s. You have come of age in an era in which our politics has been pretty rancorous. So you have seen a lot of the people that we might ordinarily look to as leaders not necessarily behaving in ways that you want to emulate. You've also seen a lot of the institutions that, say, folks who are maybe about twice your age, like I am, your parents, your grandparents, a lot of the institutions that maybe used to have a lot of trust around them, you all have seen them falter, slip, mess up. I'm thinking about some of your earliest memories might be of the housing crisis in 2008, an economic recession in 2009, where it seems like the rich got really rich and the poor started to get really poor. You all are part of the first generation in all of American history since Jamestown, since the 17th century, that is projected to be less well off than your parents' generation for the first time in American history. I also think it's telling that some of the books that you all came up with as kids are books about grown-ups messing up the world and kids having to fix it. So think about Harry Potter or the Hunger Games, where like grown-ups irrevocably screwed up the world. And you're poring over these pages as a kid, reading about how Katniss is going to save everything. Is that a fair rendering of the Hunger Games? That's the one-sentence version, right? So I tend to think that a lot of the pundits have gotten you guys wrong, because the students who I teach, and I think this is probably true, Dr. Ditzel, Dr. Hoffmann, the students who you teach, I tend to see them as very engaged, very concerned about the world around them, wanting to make things better, interested and committed to things that are bigger than themselves. That's what I think the story is of you guys. It could be that maybe I'm just spoiled and I have extra great students or something, but I tend to think that a lot of the punditry has gotten you guys wrong, and that it tends to see you as disengaged from the public square, when in fact, you maybe feel like the public square just wasn't designed to solve problems in the way that Dr. Hoffmann is describing. I'm curious, I'm going to take it back in a moment, but I'm curious, responses to that. Do you guys think I've missed the mark? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think you did to a degree what you did as well. I don't think it's that we feel that we aren't engaged in the political discussion. I think the major issue is that we're not represented whatsoever up in Washington. A bunch of old white dudes that are in their 70s and 80s, they're like my grandparents, even great-grandparents, which is ridiculous and mind-boggling to me. But yet, they're like, I identify myself as a libertarian, right? There is nobody up in Washington that seems to have my viewpoints. Everybody seems to be on extreme ends of things, and then there's no discussion. It's nothing but hate between these groups, between Republicans and Democrats.
So in what I hear in what you're saying, and we need to address this, is polarization. That it does feel like we are maybe sort of moving to the political poles. So I want for us to address that as when we move on. But other reactions to what I said. As I said, I'm trying something out here. Kate? Yes. And so I'm going to repeat that just quickly if you couldn't hear what Kate said, is that the way that you guys engage in the public square, or we could say the way that you express ideas and public opinions, is maybe different than the way my instinct guides me, or I would say Dr. Hoffmann, folks who are maybe a little bit older than you. So I think about, like, let's say my parents, who were born in the early 50s. Growing up, their communities were organized around things like civic clubs, political parties, trade unions, religious congregations, sports teams. It's much less likely that those things are going to constitute the public square for, say, you guys. You are much more likely to express ideas through social media and in other mechanisms. Last comment to you.
Just because of our age difference, and I think it's really cool the different opinions that we do have and we've experienced with things. I just feel like a big gap is like respect. We all need to learn to respect people above us as well as respect people below us.
That's right. And so the comment, if you couldn't hear, was about how often I think particularly on the basis of age, you feel somehow like you're just taken a little bit less seriously in public discourse. So I'm curious from our panelists, Dr. Ditzel, Vivian, Dr. Hoffmann, reactions to what we've just heard. And it's possible that I've gotten this wrong too. Dr. Ditzel, can we go to you?
I think you made an interesting point. Was it Kate in the back? That you guys grew up with technology, right? So that's a totally different approach, childhood experiences, and what you're used to, what's innate for you. I didn't have my first cell phone until I was a junior in college, when I could pay for it myself. But so I think that's just a huge difference, right? Like, I did not grow up with internet and obviously social media and all these things. And so your norm is different than what ours is, but it's not necessarily any better or any worse. And I do agree that that should be respected. again, it gets back to the question of how do we actually make meaning and change from these interactions? But you have to start somewhere, and if that's where people are already naturally, then thinking about pathways and mediums, which many organizations do, to do something with those groups and how you come together.
I tend to agree. I think every generation, as you go down the line, has been given different tools and different resources as how to join the conversation and how to participate. But there's such a stark difference with technology. I mean, it's just changed everything. And I think we're one of the first generations who's really had to come to terms with this. And I guess to go back to that earlier point of like, what is the purpose of these online platforms? It's not really geared towards giving us answers. It's more of like starting a conversation and then, okay, let's set that aside. Like, that doesn't really influence real politics, like you said. There's no real effects that come out of all these conversations. And so it's hard to, I completely agree. I think both should be respected, but they're so different that it's hard to put them together and then come up with real solutions that will help everyone.
And sometimes we have the illusion of participation in social media. It's sort of like it gives us the illusion that we're a part of a discussion or something. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter in the same way that voting is going to matter. It doesn't really matter in the same way that, say, calling a legislator is going to matter. I'm curious, Dr. Hoffmann, what are your reactions to that?
Well, I'm not sure how I feel about it because, again, my experience is that when people can be in synchronous, place and time with each other, and you can kind of move through a process of deliberation rather than advocacy, that you create something that's bigger than what you can create in a strictly online forum. But I think the thing I'm most struck by is I couldn't agree with you more. You are so not represented. And this is where we get to that. You got to jump in, right? You're not going to be represented until you knock all those 80-year-olds out of there and replace them with 26 and 27-year-olds. And so local government is the place for you to start. We should have term limits on everybody, right? It shouldn't just be presidents. We should have term limits on, because democracy was always meant to be, we're moving in and out, right? Literally, citizen and representative, those two went hand in hand. And so I just can't wait till I see you represented in the school board and, in the city council and as a state senator. The places where we start local. We think globally, but we got to act locally. And we got to jump in because it's your turn. It's so your turn. But they're not going to give it to you. Power corrupts, okay? And people don't want to give power up. So I want you to just dive in there and grab it because you're going to save us.
And I just wonder how you all feel about that, right? I think and I agree and want to echo what he said about representation matters and thinking about elected officials and to the extent that they're not reflected of you all in this room. But also power is a huge aspect of that. And like you just said, they're not going to give it up. And I fear that so many people are becoming increasingly apathetic. And so we know voting is the result of trying to make those changes. But if people feel like it doesn't matter and they're not represented, like how do we combat that in order to change the public discourse?
And I want to address something on that note, people being represented or not represented. We've only referenced it gently or just a little bit. But in some ways, a lot of the mechanisms of public engagement, the public square in American history has been designed specifically to keep some people in and some people out. So the long trajectory of American history has been a question of inclusion and exclusion. And I would point specifically to the question of race. We have a public square that has been, for most of American history, specifically designed to exclude people on the basis of their race, not just in the technical mechanisms of voting, serving on juries, making decisions, running for public office, but also being a part of a discussion, being invited to share ideas. And I'm curious from our panelists if we can address that, either in a historical context or in a contemporary context.
I mean, it's important to acknowledge, right? Being considered a citizen as opposed to 3/5 of a person, like all of that obviously matters in that engagement. And then, but different people coming into the country, migration, immigration, and how you're treated, viewed, the rights that you have, all of that absolutely matters and influences things today. There's still structures that perpetuate numerous inequities, but hopefully there are shifts and change with that. I mean, I often give the example when thinking about education, right? Education was initially for white male property owners. It wasn't for women. It wasn't for Black people who literally, it was against the law to learn to read or write. And so one could argue that the system is functioning as it was designed. Would hope that's not the case with the idea of democracy, but it was not for every person and its origin.
If I could offer an example, I know that often, I'm a historian by training, and I know that often we imagine that history is much further away from us than it really is. But to share, I was born in 1984. My parents they met each other in 1976. They got married in 1980. When they got married, they got bought a house, got a mortgage for that house. In America, most people's wealth is tied up in the property that they own, the house that they own. In the town where my parents lived, had they not been white, they very likely would not have gotten a mortgage. So much of the lives that we lead are wrapped up in, that is to say, they wouldn't have probably owned a house. It would have been the difference between being part of the a much sort of lower socioeconomic status or being in the middle class. So much of my life has been born by of privilege has been born of the fact that I had parents who I guess had that had those assets, and I think that maybe we have the perception that these things are very distant in the distant past, but in fact they're not. They're very much a part of the world that we are inhabiting today. Is that a fair statement from Dr. Ditzel, particularly with your training in public administration and political science? Is that a fair way to look at this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about redlining and people being denied loans and different things. And again, those are systems that are operating in such a way to exclude people. Absolutely, that continues to matter. I mean, if you look around Georgia College's campus and who's present and who's not, and how that compares to the community of Milledgeville, these are continued issues in thinking about access, opportunity, power, right? So unfortunately, it's not that long ago. Like schools integrated, they were supposed to in the 60s and 70s. I know that might seem like a long time ago to you guys, but that's what the generation of my parents. It's really kind of crazy to think about.
That's right. Other thoughts from our panelists about inclusion and exclusion in the public square. Dr. Hoffmann, Ms. Cassaniti.
I think there are rippling effects of the things that we're talking about, and like I said earlier, they've always been there, but specifically the pandemic has just highlighted them even more for us all to see. And if we take sort of an economic approach, there's a lot of industry, specifically agriculture, but there's a lot of industry in rural Georgia, and parts of rural Georgia tend to be the ones that are experiencing a lot of these effects. And so representative-wise, like industry-wise, a lot of our growth as a state is driven by those populations who were set up poorly from the beginning. And now that they're not included in these conversations, now that it's harder for them to get involved because of the system that has been set up, it just further creates this divide. And it's just not that inclusive, democratic system that we think it is sometimes, most of the time, I'd say.
On that note, you see something up on your screen there, on the screen. And Dr. Hoffmann, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Georgia College's Best in the Nation status 2 years ago.
Yes, please, because this is a part, really, seriously, You have no idea how inspirational, she tried to say, right? You are. We think of voting as an individual thing, like something that we do, and it is individual, private. It's nobody's business for whom or what you vote, right? But it is everybody's business that you vote, and the health of a democracy is in the degree to which we're enfranchised, and we're exercising that. And you guys in the last 10 years have been phenomenal, and I have slides, but I didn't think they'd be that far away. So I may have to kind of, I just want to show you what you have done and just tell you how much it means. Am I going the right way?
Yep.
Yeah.
Just keep going.
Yeah. Oh, we're going.
There you
There
go.
we go. But we're there. Can you see that? Because I'm looking way up there, so I can't see any of that, and unfortunately did not bring the printed copies with me. But what you should see, and this is collected data over the 2014, 2018, and 2020 elections for Georgia College and State University. It actually comes from, our participation in the Tufts University National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, or the NSLVE survey data. And they've been compiling it since 2012 for all the participating colleges and universities. So this is kind of a little summary slide. And again, think that 2014 and 2018 are midterm elections. They're much less generally, we vote far less for those than we do in the presidential elections of 2020. But what I want you to be able to see is that as a group, as an entity, as an institution, we have, I'm going to skip I can't even see it from here. I feel, I want to skip the thing that's over there on the left that has the 40%, because I think that was from 2014. I'm going to try to see if I can bring this up on my phone. But if you just look at those graphs, you see that in 2014, it starts with our registration rate. And in 2014, is it here? Oh, I can't quite see it. Our voter registration rate in 2014 was, what is that? Can anyone see that? 60? Is it? Thank you. Which was above the national student population average. And then you go up to 2018 and you see our registration rate is, you tell me? 85%. 85% of you guys were registered to vote in 2018. That is so much higher than the national college student average, okay? We won an award that year. Go to 2020, what's that registration rate now? Or then? 90, and see 90 is like 94.7? 94.7 of you registered to vote. That's the best, that was the best in the nation. The best public liberal arts college in the nation in terms of registration rate in 2020 was you. And that's just goosebumpy to me, okay? We're like just 6 percentage points away from literally being 100% registered. So that's kind of awesome. That's a challenge. I'm hoping that we can actually, make that a reality in 2022. But literally best in the nation, and you've won awards for that kind of engagement. And so that is fabulous. I'm looking over at the next set of graphs, and that should show the voting rate. And I believe, so again, you see it's going up every year, right? Which is the important part. But the voting rate in the middle there is what percentage of your registered voters actually voted. So look at that middle graph and realize how important that is. That's who pulled the trigger. It doesn't matter a lot if you're registered if you don't make it, right, to the polls some way and get your vote counted. So in 2014, it was like 19% of the, what was it, 60-some percent in that first graph, 19% of 60-something percent actually voted. that's not so good, again, in terms of representation, in terms of really being able to move the lever, if you will. In 2018, okay, the voting rate went up to 40-something%, and that was above the national average. So we won an award for that. Okay, so better than, when I say national average, national college student average. So that's good, but that's still not good. You know what I'm saying? Like, so that's like 40% of the 80% who were registered voted. Then you get to, 2020, and the trigger was so much better pulled because we had 94.7% of you registered and over 75%, if I remember correctly, actually of that voted. So that's just huge, and that's so important, that's so wonderful. And then that far right graph, again, that one, the lowest of all of them is what percentage of eligible Georgia college students voted. So, all of that could, you see, we're still kind of far short of where we'd like to be. And so you are phenomenal. And the challenge for 2022 is if we can get our voting rate for this midterm over 50%, because it was 40% for the last one, that would be a huge increase. And if we could get that last 6% of Georgia college students registered, then we would be, again, best in nation. Yeah, it would be pretty good to get that again. And I have another chart that you can read better than I can, and it's the how you voted real quick. I'm sorry, am I taking, so gold, award winning, you guys vote. You really are much better than average. This next one, you can probably see, you've got how you voted. 2016, 2018? 2014, 2018, and 2020. The inside circle of each one of those is Georgia College and State University students. The outside circle is national college students. And what I don't know if you can see large enough to note, but just to make a long story short, we didn't have any early voting statistics until 2020. But if you look at the difference between mail-in vote, absentee ballots in 2014 to 2016 to 2020, you see that your preference for how you vote flipped from 63% absentee to 63% early voting. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so all of this is my way of just, and you saw the half sheet I gave you, right? That was like, early voting is probably going to be the easiest and most effective way for you to exercise, your vote. And there's 2 Saturdays in October that I just want you to like make a plan for how you're going to vote, and then remember to do it, because that's the hardest part. Which is why you put up the turbo vote.
Yeah, if you can hand that back, I can
get
to it.
Because I think we all want to do it, but you guys don't. There's a lot going on in your lives. So we would urge you to opt in and sign up for turbovote.org, who is our partner. And if you opt in, they will send you reminders, however you want them, on email or text message, so that you remember what's the deadline, where do I need to go, how do I need to do this? Because I think I just really want you to make a plan for however you're going to vote, and then pull the trigger on it. So thank you for letting me make that spiel. I'm the grassroots person here. I'm like the person with a small d on democracy. These guys have a lot of the great answers for the big questions. All I can do is kind of say, okay, let's get this done. Let's move ourselves forward. So thank you so much for letting me share that. And I just really want to give you guys a hand, and I hope you will join me. You guys are best in the nation. You really are. Well done, okay? You gotta own that. It's phenomenal.
So to keep that best in the nation status, you can, if you take a look at what's on the screen right now, check out your Georgia voter registration, sign up at TurboVote, and you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen some dates that you might want to mark. And remember, Turbo Vote will help you to remember those things. I would like to transition to some questions that you all might have for our panelists. Questions about anything that we've raised, and anything that you might like to hear. What questions do we have? Yes, Kate's going to bring you a microphone. And tell us your name and say in a big voice what your question is. Oops, switch it on.
My name is Braden Miller, and I thought Dr. Hoffmann had a particularly salient point when she talked about the anti-social media, but I thought it was interesting that she portrayed that as such a negative thing. I've grown up hearing stories about people being like tarred and feathered at voting ballots or intimidated to not actually give their true opinion. But we live in a time where our public square, it's so anonymous and uninhibited. Anyone can give an opinion that is like utterly puerile or even ill-intentioned. But wouldn't you say that having that sort of holistic honesty would give us a better picture of what our state of a nation actually is?
Well said. And yes, in many ways. It's like everything else. It's, you know, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's the best thing for us, it's the worst thing for us. It's both and, isn't it? It's what we make of it. And I just worry more than anything else about how easy it is to spread big lies through large platforms of social media, and how easy it is for people to get away with big lies and conspiracy theories. They fly faster, than they used to. So, again, I'm definitely headed toward Valinor via the Grey Havens on the elf ship out. You know what I mean? It's like our day is done. That day is gone. There's a new day. There's a new dawn. There's a new way of doing things. So I'm not worried when I look at you guys. I think you're going to save us. I really do. So I'm sorry, I don't really have an answer for you, but keep talking.
And I would echo, don't mean to put words in your mouth, Dr. Ditzel, but something you said earlier is the nature of the discourse that we have depends upon the quality of our intention. That we have to, I hope I'm characterizing this correctly, that we need to bring our best of intentions into the public square, well-informed, and is that what you said earlier?
I don't know if I said that.
Oh.
I don't disagree with that, though. I agree, and I think, social media makes some people bold, right? So that's part of the negative aspect. Things that you wouldn't say in person or necessarily voice, you do behind the blank screen. So again, I do think it's both and pros and cons. And perhaps you want to know the true nature of people, but I also think when thinking about public discourse, so what? If we're not moving toward solutions or moving towards some sort of intentional change, then you surmising about X, Y, and Z isn't necessarily productive in thinking about public discourse.
I'm afraid that we're nearing the end of our time. We perhaps have time for one more question from the group, but I would encourage you, if you have questions for one of our panelists, to stick around. Let's take one more question. Margot?
Hi, I'm Margot. So something that I was kind of thinking about was like, the modern public square is definitely like, I think of like Twitter as like the classic example of the modern public square. And it's not built to be a public square, it's built to increase engagement for revenue. And so I guess thinking about that, what if corporations have a responsibility to uphold the quality of the public square, what are the nature of those responsibilities? I'm specifically talking about what comes to mind is algorithms can force us into like, we're given like a limited scope of information, and therefore that can really shape like the opinions we have because we're only shown specific sides of arguments. And then also like the potential, I guess, kind of cost-benefit analysis of censorship. Like, does every opinion, like, should every opinion be blasted, even if it's like just straight up like false information or harmful in some other way? So like, what responsibility, if any, do corporations have to us, like to the public square?
Vivian, do you have an answer?
I'm hesitant to say, I don't think they would. I'm hesitant to place responsibility on corporations, honestly. I don't know that they are the ones who should be, who should take on this challenge of monitoring, well, not monitoring, but should take on the challenge of the public square. I think something that's inherent in the public square is that A, which I know we talked about, but everyone can access that, and that's just not true of Twitter or other things online. But B, that it's rooted in like democratic public coming together. And that's where my answer stops, because the next logical question is, well, then what is that? And I just don't know. I would tend to, when we talk about the modern public square, I put that on technology, much like your question sort of frames it. I don't know if it should. I don't think it should. But if it's not technology, then what is it and where is it? So it's kind of like a roundabout answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Do our other panelists have contributions?
Well, public deliberation forums and that kind of training where you really do convene groups of people in multiple places at multiple times and offer childcare and food and all the things that people need in order to be able to get there and be there is one micro answer that people are using quite successfully. Since the premise is, it's not an either or. We're not here just to share our opinions. We are here to try to move towards action. And so we're going to lay out at least 3 options for this particular policy or this particular decision. And we're going to really wrestle with all of the value dilemmas and all the trade-offs and what you have to give up if you do that, because we have limited resources. That's something that citizens can do for themselves. And that can be done in an old-fashioned or in a digital platform, right?
Or hybrid, right?
Way. So again, it's a small d, it's democracy in terms of how it's lived.
I do agree with that. And I think that can be extremely valuable, especially when done in an authentic way. When you bring people together and have the different things, childcare, transportation, food, and people feel empowered, they're going to want to continue when it's genuine and not just to be able to check off that you had that community meeting and going on and doing what you already intended. I do agree that I wouldn't put responsibility on the corporate sector, and in short, thinking about the public good, right? That's essentially why nonprofits were created, because of government and market failure. It's not happening for whatever reason. So these are people coming together in order to try and solve some of these problems and put forth the social good for all.
Well, with that, I want to thank you all for your excellent contributions. I'll encourage you, if you have questions for our panelists, to stay behind. We're happy to help, answer questions for you. I'd also very quickly ask that you pull out your telephones and follow us online at Lead Creatively, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And we'll have updates for you about leadership, events that you might be interested in participating in, and some of these reminders about Turbo Vote and how to make sure that you are, in fact, registered to vote. With that said, thank you all for being here, and I wish you a good evening. Thank you.